based on voluntary demand, pay evisceration fees that are imposed by bureaucratic apparatuses, they not only receive absolutely nothing for doing so, but also deplete their hard-earned money. By depleting their hard-earned money on paying evisceration fees that are imposed by bureaucratic apparatuses that they receive absolutely nothing for paying, it is also far more cumbersome for them to establish a sizable investment portfolio. If a person has more fiat currency on hand to earmark into acquiring investment securities, then it is less arduous for him to compound his wealth. By having more fiat currency on hand, a person has more fiat currency to allocate into acquiring investment securities that are able to furnish a person with recurring investment income, such as safe stocks that have high dividend yields from highly profitable companies, AAA-rated long-term corporate bonds from highly profitable companies, index mutual funds that have a stellar performance track record, actively managed mutual funds that have a stellar performance track record, index exchange-traded funds that have a stellar performance track record, and actively managed exchange-traded funds that have a stellar performance track record. An investor should be acutely aware that in spite of how enticing an investment security may be, he is not guaranteed to reap a positive return on investment if he decides to invest in purchasing an investment security. An investor should
Welcome
only
back
consider
and prepared to
investing
be
in purchasing investment securities if he can afford to risk potentially squandering investment dollars. The imposition of evisceration fees amplifies the prices of products in an economy. Companies that acquiesce to paying evisceration fees on their purchase orders are at a high probability to indirectly pass on the cost of paying evisceration fees on their purchase orders to the members of their target market by significantly amplifying the prices of their products. When companies indirectly pass on the cost of paying evisceration fees on their purchase orders to the members of their target market by significantly amplifying the prices of their products, then they often do so in a manner that allows them to at least maintain their profit margin per product sold. Companies often prefer to not elicit an extremely low profit margin per product sold. If companies were to have an extremely low profit margin per product sold, it then can undermine their net income potential. By maintaining a high profit margin per product sold, it is less cumbersome for companies to be able to furnish massive compensations to their executives, less arduous for companies to be able to furnish sizable retainer fees to their external directors, and less cumbersome for companies to maximize the wealth of their shareholders. Furthermore, by maintaining a high profit margin per product sold, companies have more capital to earmark into research and development efforts and expansion pursuits. The imposition of evisceration fees adversely impacts an economy in a multitude of disparate ways. The imposition of evisceration fees can reduce the standard of living for people who work real private sector jobs based on voluntary demand. This is because the imposition of evisceration fees can significantly amplify the financial cost of living for people who work real private sector jobs based on voluntary demand. It is calamitous for the financial cost of living to be exorbitant. When the financial cost of living significantly amplifies, it then can render it more cumbersome for people who are part of the real private sector workforce to be able to afford to attain an extremely low standard of living. Most real private sector employee jobs based on voluntary demand do not furnish people who work them with enough fiat currency to be able to afford to attain an extremely low standard of living. As of July of 2025, the total cost to attain an extremely low standard of living can be eminently sizable. In order to attain an extremely low standard of living, a person needs to earn enough fiat currency to at least not only be able to afford to pay the perpetually recurring room rental fee and be able to afford to purchase a vehicle, purchase functional vehicle parts, incessantly purchase food, incessantly purchase fuel for his vehicle, and incessantly purchase oil for his vehicle, but also needs to earn enough fiat currency to at least be able to afford to pay the perpetually recurring exorbitant auto insurance premium, the perpetually recurring driver's license renewal fee, the perpetually recurring exorbitant vehicle registration fee, the perpetually recurring tire rotation fee, the perpetually recurring internet subscription service fee, and the perpetually recurring smartphone subscription service fee. Certain people deem it to be extraordinarily arduous for them to sustain living their lives in contexts in which they succumb to metaphorically precipitously slumping into the financially indebted economic class. It is eminently undesirable for a person to be part of the financially indebted economic class. The financially indebted economic class is an economic class that is comprised of an exorbitant amount of financially indebted people who have egregiously low income levels. The people who are subsumed under the financially indebted economic class often have a financially destitute standard of living and are often unable to afford to attain their basic needs, such as the housing need and transportation need. An exorbitant amount of people who are subsumed under the financially indebted economic class work real private sector jobs based on voluntary demand. People who are subsumed under the financially indebted economic class have outstanding financial debt balances. The financially indebted economic class is an economic class that is comprised of financially indebted people who often have egregiously abysmal financial health. Having egregiously abysmal financial health can be eminently deleterious to a person's overall health, since it can induce chronic stress. A financially destitute standard of living is the standard of living that people who are part of the financially indebted economic class have. People who are part of the financially indebted economic class do not aspire to have a financially destitute standard of living for the remainder of their lifetimes. Having a financially destitute standard of living can also adversely affect a person's well-being. Furthermore, having a financially destitute standard of living can also render a person all the more vulnerable to succumb to poor health. Moreover, having a financially destitute standard of living also denotes that a person lacks financial stability and financial security. It is eminently undesirable for a person to have a financially destitute standard of living, since having a financially destitute standard of living can adversely impinge on a person's quality of life. It can be ineffably calamitous for a person to have debt. Having debt can adversely impinge on a financially indebted person's quality of life, since it can be eminently cumbersome for a financially indebted person who lacks extreme wealth to be able to generate enough revenue to be able to pay off his outstanding financial debts, especially in contexts in which his outstanding financial debt balances continue to ceaselessly amplify from the accrual of recurring late fees and recurring interest fees. It is eminently undesirable in all facets to be laden with debt. It can be eminently expensive for a financially indebted person to service financial debts by making monthly payments towards his outstanding financial debt balances. When a financially indebted person pays recurring late fees and recurring interest fees on his outstanding financial debts, he then does not receive anything for doing so. An indebted person should aim to pay off his debts. Having financial debt can adversely impinge on a financially indebted person's financial health. Having debt can also render an indebted person all the more vulnerable to succumb to chronic stress, since it can be cumbersome for an indebted person to cope with the acute stress of being laden with debt. When a financially indebted person pays recurring late fees and recurring interest fees on his outstanding financial debts, he then does not receive anything for doing so and winds up having less fiat currency to earmark into acquiring investment securities that can furnish him with recurring investment income. If a financially indebted person were to pay off his outstanding financial debts, he then can significantly augment his standard of living. If a person were to significantly augment his standard of living, he then can possibly improve his quality of life. I hope that you were enthralled, bedazzled, regaled, captivated, mesmerized, amused, floored, and fascinated. I hope that you were entrenched in the unalloyed epicness. Thanks for watching. Have a blissful day. I hope that you were enthralled, bedazzled, regaled, captivated, mesmerized, amused, floored, and fascinated. I hope that you were entrenched in the unalloyed epicness. Thanks for watching. Have a blissful day. I hope that you were enthralled, bedazzled, regaled, captivated, mesmerized, amused, floored, and fascinated. Welcome back and prepared to be bedazzled, because another ineffably epic video is slated to commence. Today I wanted to notify you of a reason as to why certain people feel that they live their lives on the ultra-hard difficulty mode. Certain people feel that they live their lives on the ultra-hard difficulty mode as a corollary of how cumbersome it is for them to sustain living their lives. Certain people deem it to be extraordinarily arduous for them to sustain living their lives in contexts in which they succumb to early life slavery. Compulsory imprisonment is manifested in the form of early life slavery in this controlled market economy. Lamentably, as of September of 2025, most people succumb to the calamitous torments of early life slavery in this controlled market economy. One reason appertaining to why the land of harrowing slavery and harrowing oppression is a dreadful territory to reside in during a person's childhood years is attributed to there being compulsory imprisonment at the 13-year K-12 compulsory concentration camp in the land of harrowing slavery and harrowing oppression. Succinctly stated, compulsory imprisonment is a term that delineates a mandate to attend a 13-year K-12 compulsory concentration camp that is imposed against people people against their own volition. Compulsory imprisonment is eminently fruitless in all facets and is devoid of redeeming qualities. Furthermore, compulsory imprisonment serves as one of the reprehensible underpinnings for bringing a broken economy to fruition that is in a perpetual depression. Moreover, compulsory imprisonment is a flagrantly execrable, calamitous injustice in all facets. Compulsory imprisonment is the antithesis of a favorable economic policy and is severely devastating to the economy in all facets. A robust economy is an economy that is devoid of unfavorable economic policies. Furthermore, a robust economy is also an economy that is not only devoid of compulsory imprisonment, but that is also replete with favorable economic policies.